فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So as I mentioned before, I'm writing my second edition to my book, The Bible and the Quran, Biblical Figures in the Islamic Tradition. And one of my responsibilities with my co-author, John Kaltner, is to write about the stories of the Prophet's literature. So how have these various figures been imagined and reimagined throughout Islamic history? And what are the areas that they focus on? How do they see these various prophets and messengers? So for today, I want to speak about Zechariah or Zakariyya. And Zechariah is a really fascinating figure within the Quran and the biblical tradition. And the stories of the prophet literature emphasize his role as the caretaker of Maryam. So he's someone that he does kafada, or he takes care of Maryam, that she's someone who is younger, she grows up in the temple, and he's the one that checks up on her and visits her. And it emphasizes that he's the father of John, or Yahya, and a prophet who called out to God. So one of his prayers he makes is a foundational prayer in the Quran and is seen as a model of emulation. For instance, the literature highlights Zakariyya's prayer that he called out to God in a silent way, or khafiyya. So this is interesting that when you think about calling out, right, you think about calling out in a loud voice or screaming to God, so making sure God can hear you. So Zakariyya is someone who is understood to call out in a silent way. And the commentators debate this. What does this mean? And they say that has to do with the fact that he was by himself. No one was there, right? And this is a constant theme that we see in the Islam and in the Quran about the idea of khadwa, being by yourself. And in these moments of isolation, of solitude, you have this close connection with God. Some narrations note that verily God knows a pure heart and hears the hidden voice. So this is something that the commentator Ibn Kathir mentions, that you don't have to scream, right? You don't have to yell, right? You can say and make a prayer in a soft voice and God can hear you. And Zakariyya models that. And Zakariyya then also describes his plight. So in the Quran, there are different types of prayers. Some of them are ones that are commands, saying do this or do that. But part of the etiquette of prayer in the Islamic tradition is what they call wasf al-hal, or you describe your state. And he describes his state before he makes his prayer. So he says, Lord, my bones have weakened and my hair is ashen gray, but never, Lord, have I ever prayed to you in vain, right? So this is important, that he's saying that he's old, right? Very old. That he's someone who has become weak in the inside and the outside, as represented by his bones and his hair. Zakariyya makes this prayer during his caretaking of Maryam, or Mary. Every time he entered her sanctuary, he found that she had fruits out of season, or fruits of summer in the winter, and fruits of winter in the summer. The fruits represent the miracles of those who are close to God, or friends and saints. So this is something we've talked about many times over the podcast, and also as a chapter in the book, whether Maryam is a saint or a friend of God, or is she a prophet, Nabiya. So there are different words used between waliya and that of Nabiya. But many of the commentators, and historically she's been understood as a waliya, someone who was close to God, a friend of God, potentially even a saint, in the sense that since she's a waliya, she can have miracles. And one of her miracles is that God fed her and gave her food that was not regularly found. Zakariyya then had an epiphany when he saw this miracle. And if God was the provider of fruits out of their time, he was able to provide a child even with his challenge of old age. Zakariyya wanted to have a righteous offspring, and he feared after him that the children of Israel would not follow the commands of God and obey him. So he prayed for a child that would be righteous, pious, and pleasing to God. He then prayed, explaining his dilemma. He says, I fear what my kinsmen will do when I'm gone, for my wife is barren. So grant me a successor, a gift from you, to be my heir, and the heir of the family of Jacob. Lord, make him well-pleasing to you. So this is a fascinating prayer, and that he's open about his fear. And his fear is that when he dies and when he passes away, no one will continue his legacy. No one will be his heir. And not heir in the sense of that of physical or material wealth, but rather heir in terms of his spiritual legacy as a father, a spiritual legacy as a prophet. And he wants this child not simply to make money or to get a fancy degree, but rather to be pleasing to the divine. Some narrations note that Zakariyya was 77 at the time, or even older, right? So this is someone who is advanced in age. Usually when people pass the age of 50, 60, 70, they're no longer thinking about having new kids, but he has this fear as he realizes his death and his demise is close. Some of the commentators here are quick to note that Zakariyya's prayer deals with spiritual inheritance and not that of wealth. This is similar to Sulaiman or Solomon being the inheritance of his father David Dawood in terms of prophecy and kinship. Some prophetic reports also note that the prophets do not leave inheritance but only charity. And this is especially important regarding the Prophet Muhammad. So in terms of his legacy, did his inheritance supposed to go to Ali, to Fatima, to Hassan and Hussein? Or was his legacy more of teachings and learning? And there's that debate, and you see that difference between Sunni and Shi'i Islam. And third, worldly belongings were beneath the prophets and was of no interest to them and their offspring. Rather, they were interested in asceticism, zuhud, and not hoarding and amassing goods. So many of the prophets, because they're devoted to the worship of God and not being attached to this world, they weren't interested in necessarily in wills and inheritance in the material sense. And last, Zakariyya was a carpenter, working with his hands and eating from what he earned. Just like David, Dawood would eat from what his hands earned. Prophets in their situation, for the most part, would not exert themselves more than they should, taking more than what they needed, and leave behind belongings for those after them. So this is important in the sense that he is understood within the biblical and the Islamic tradition as someone who worked with his hands, a carpenter. He wasn't a king, and he wasn't someone in a palace or mansion somewhere, but because he was a carpenter, he didn't necessarily have a lot of goods that he could give to his offspring. Now, Zakariyya asked for a sign, and this is interesting because when he asked for a sign, this is different than Maryam, who doesn't ask for a sign when the messenger comes to her. And he's told that he should not speak to people for 3 days and 3 nights. Some of the commentators mentioned that he read and remembered God, but he was not able to speak to anyone. So this is interesting, is that he was able to make noise and he was able to utter things, but he wasn't able to communicate with anyone directly. Zakariyya then goes out to his people praising God in the morning and evening and encouraging them to do the same through signs. And this is something that maybe demonstrates that the idea of sign language was present during that time and part of the Islamic Muslim tradition as well as the biblical, that it was seen as appropriate or to do a vow of silence, but then still communicate with people on what you needed. Zakariyya continues to remember God and is seen as righteous even though he asks God for reassurance and confirmation. So this is important, that silence does not mean that you are a bad person, but silence is a way actually to get close to God and to only speak to him. The literature further emphasizes Zakariyya's role as a caretaker. For instance, there was a debate regarding who was going to take care of Maryam, as some traditions state that her mother wrapped her in a cloak and left her at the doorstep of the temple as she worried that they wouldn't accept her because she was a girl. And this is really interesting, and I have other podcast episodes on this, is that the mother of Maryam or Anna or Hannad, she was someone who imagined that she was going to have a boy, right? So she has this girl, and then all of a sudden she says in the Quran, God, I have this girl. How is this girl going to serve the temple? And then the divine voice comes and reassures her and explains to her that, don't worry, this was intentional, and we're going to name her Maryam, and she's going to live a righteous life and be chosen above all of humanity. Zakariyya, who was the head of the rabbis, stated that I have the most right to her, or to Maryam, as his wife was Maryam's maternal aunt. And this was fascinating when I researched this, and something I didn't pick up on before, is that Zakariyya wasn't the direct uncle of Mary or Maryam. Rather, Zakariyya was married to the aunt, the maternal aunt, Mary. So Maryam's sister was Zakariyya's wife. However, the rabbis decided to draw lots to see who would take care of her, which Zakariyya won 3 times. In particular, there was this tradition to gather all the pens of the rabbis, cover them, and then say to one of the boys of the temple, enter your hand. Whoever's pen was taken out won the lot. They performed this tradition, and Zakariyya's pen came out. And then they said, we are not satisfied, right? Zakariyya won the first lot, but they did not accept this and wanted to make sure there was another opportunity for the other rabbis to win. Rather, they said, let us throw our pens into the water, and whoever's pen wins within the current has the most right to her. They then threw their pens within the Jordan River, or a spring, and Zakariyya's pen won again. Some narrations describe the scene as 19 men coming to the river, full of rabbis and noblemen, and Zakariyya's pen coming to the surface of the water, while the others sank and fell to the bottom. Zakariyya then began to take care of Maryam, building her a room within the temple, and then visiting and checking up on her. So in conclusion, we see a couple of fascinating points regarding Zakariyya. So Zakariyya, in the Islamic tradition, is seen as a rabbi. He's seen as someone who is Jewish, someone who is part of this prophetic legacy, and he is someone that is old, right? He's introduced as a character that is advanced in age, someone who is learned but is desperate. He knows that he's going to pass away, and he makes this impassionate prayer saying, God, I'm old, I'm weak, and I'm worried, right? And this is something I love about the Qur'anic prayers, is that he is very open about his fears and his emotional state. And he talks about this idea that I fear that when I'm gone, there's going to be no one else here to listen, to continue my prophetic and spiritual legacy. He's also someone that is seen as a caretaker, and he takes care of Maryam even though he's not directly related to her. And this is interesting in the concept of kafala, of caretaking, that even though Maryam is a girl and she's seen as someone who is righteous and not directly related to him, he still feels this responsibility to take care of her and to go visit and check up on her and see how she's doing. So this is something that even in modern film and art is demonstrated, that Zakariyya, he felt this obligation to have Maryam within the sanctuary. In some traditions, he builds her a house. He builds her a mihrab and in the temple area, and she is part of this clerical class and worships in the same space and also reflects on the divine. But in the moment of his caretaking, he also learns from Maryam. And this is something that I think is why Zakariyya can be a role model and a model of emulation, is that while he's watching over her, he realizes that she's special, that she has these divine favors and miracles. And he sees that she is someone that has these fruits out of season, the fruits of the winter and the summer, and the fruits of the summer and the winter. And he asks her a question. I mean, he's a rabbi, right? He's someone that is knowledgeable and learned of the Torah. So you would think that Maryam should learn from him. But he realizes that something unique and special is going on. And through his humility, he asks this girl what is happening. And she explains to him that God is the one who provides, the sustainer, Ar-Razzaq. And then this leads to Epiphany, where he actually then goes ahead and prays to God for a child. And eventually God gives him that child. So we see so many facets of Zakariyya. The Zakariyya is a important character within the Quran, not necessarily as important as maybe Ibrahim or Abraham, Moses, Musa, or even Mary and Maryam, but Zakariyya plays this remarkable role as a caretaker of Maryam and someone who is humble and calls out to God in a state of vulnerability and weakness. So thanks so much for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. You can order my book, The Islamic Mary. I'm really excited that some book clubs have been picking up my book and creating discussion boards. Also, people are reaching out in companies and saying, hey, look, this book is important in regards to our interfaith work and making sure our various partners and employees are working together on a common goal and mission. I want to encourage you to subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. We see an increased listenership on all the platforms and people listening to podcasts now on video platforms like YouTube. Encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to the podcast. So I'm really excited. I have a couple of speaking engagements this fall, and a lot of the folks are assigning the podcast to people beforehand to be familiar with the content and the material. It might be hard to read the entire book before a book talk, but maybe listen to a couple of podcast episodes and be familiar with the content. We're almost over 100 episodes of the Islamic Mary podcast. So I've been trying to do this podcast every week. And since we have this library now of interviews, of monologues, Qur'anic commentary, also discussions of my forthcoming second edition of my book, The Quran and Bible, Biblical Figures in the Islamic Tradition, you can review this podcast. And reviews always help other people find the podcast and encourage them to listen to it. And you can visit my website and join my newsletter, where you'll be updated on my research and publications, as well as the Islamic Mary book tour. Thank you very much, and take care.